Hey there, Aaron here with Samick Law Life and Legacy Planning. I want to talk to you about business related stuff today, specifically having a partnership agreement or an operating agreement, membership agreement. We use a lot of different terms, and this type of agreement actually exists in different types of business entities. A partnership agreement technically is a partnership agreement in a partnership, which is different than an LLC. Now, for purposes of what I'm talking about here today, they're all kind of the same. Okay, they all do the same things. There's some slight modifications depending on the type of business entity you have, but this is going to apply to just about any business entity any small business in America is going to own. Okay, so what goes into, and I'm just going to call it a partnership agreement. If I refer to it as a membership agreement or operating agreement, they all kind of encompass the same ideas. So if we're talking about a partnership agreement, like generally speaking, what goes into it? So one of the first things you got to have are just ground rules for making decisions, right? So if you've got partners, if you spent any time with them, which hopefully before getting into business with them, you have spent some time with them, you're not going to see eye to eye on everything. But there are things that, even though you don't agree, you still got to make a decision on. And you do this if you're in a relationship, in a marriage. Like my wife and I, we don't always agree on what to do about the kids when they're misbehaving. Do we punish them this way or do we do something else? But you got to make a decision, right? And so ground rules for decision making are really critical. Who has the authority to make certain types of decisions? So for instance, if you got 3 partners and one of the partners is acting as the president or CEO, they work in the business day in and day out, and the other 2 aren't as actively involved. What can that person who's spending all their energy in the business decide without the other partners weighing in, and what types of things do the other partners need to weigh in on? And do you need 100% agreement, all 3 of them, or do you just have to have a majority vote of 2 out of 3? These sorts of things are just basic rules on how decisions get made, irrespective of what the issue that's being decided is. Second is capital contributions. So maybe you started a business and you're bootstrapping and everybody's just putting in their own time and energy on nights and weekends. Maybe you've got outside investors. Maybe you've taken out loans. Whatever the case, there may be a time when your business runs into a cash shortfall. You're too new and you don't have access to a line of credit that's going to cover you. An opportunity comes up, but you got to have $50,000 or $100,000 and a bank's not going to give it to you, or you just can't get to it quickly enough. You may need to put in your own money. Now, this is one thing if you're a solo business owner, but if you're 2 or 3 people or more, it's a lot harder to figure out how you're going to decide that. One partner wants to put their own money in, the other 2 don't. 2 want to put it in. Can 2 people in a majority vote make the third put $20,000 in? There are a lot of things that have to be considered in this, and I'm not going to cover everything here, but the long and the short of it is you need to have rules in advance for how to make those sorts of decisions. Another thing is salaries and distributions. So those are 2 different things. Salaries are just, your W-2 income. And if you own a business and you're working in the business, you should probably be paid as a W-2 employee. Now, if you have an LLC, you can take distributions and not pay yourself a salary. This gets into more kind of bookkeeping and then tax issues. If you have an LLC and you've elected to be treated as an S corporation, you have to take W-2 income. I keep saying long story short, but the reality is it's going to be better long-term for your business if you have a steady, scheduled payment plan for yourself, whether it's distributions or salary or whatever. You want to know that I'm getting paid X number of dollars per month every month. So having that set up where it's an amount you can live on is a really good idea. Now, ideally, your business makes a ton of money, and so you've got way more money than that you can pay yourself with. So that's a distribution, right? Think of salary as your steady income, and then the distribution is when you've got extra cash because you had a good year, something like that. This is even more complex or dynamic when you've got the one person, the one of 3 partners who's the full-time employee, and the others that just help out occasionally. Those partners might take distributions of profit, but that person who's spending their full time in there needs to have a salary. So variety of different issues that you can drill down on, but those are rules that you need to have in a partnership agreement to address those types of concerns. Okay, dispute resolution. How do you have fights, right? These don't have to be knockdown, drag out fights, but you're going to get to a point where you disagree about stuff. And sometimes tensions rise a little bit. There can be friction in the relationship. Having some rules ahead of time about how you're going to resolve those before you're even thinking about having fights is a good idea for this reason. When you have a set of rules already laid out and one of you realizes, the tension's rising, we're not getting along, you can pull that document out. I'm saying like physically, but you can pull it up on a computer and say, hey, just as a reminder, everybody, we already set some ground rules for how we're going to have this conversation. And I think we need to turn to this, because what it does is it takes the pressure off of each of you trying to win the argument to, okay, let's use a process. Let's use this dispute resolution mechanism so that we can figure it out. It allows you to make it less personal so that you can get through that disagreement and still maintain a working relationship with one another. Death and disability contingencies, right? So it happens. People die unexpectedly. Or, as a story I like to think of when I'm talking about this stuff with people, an investor I know of, just listened to his podcast a number of times, I don't know him personally, out in Wyoming or Idaho or something like that, had a business that he ran with his father, and this guy over the course of 12 hours became totally paralyzed, some weird, pretty rare disease. He was not feeling great one night, and then the next morning he couldn't move his head, right? He was completely paralyzed, and he was in a coma for like 3 months. What does that business do while he's not there to operate? Now, he ended up recovering. He went through rehab, started walking, like he's fine now, but there was a 6-month period where he just wasn't able to work in the business. He was fortunate. He had some things set up that allowed him to get through that process, but without having those contingencies in place, or heaven forbid he had died, who steps in to take over? What about the person who's incapacitated or has died? What does their spouse get? This is an issue people don't think about. But again, keep talking about 3 partners. One of them dies. What rights does that spouse of the now deceased person have? Do they get to step in to their spouse's shoes as a co-owner? Does the spouse get to start making decisions? You know, if you've got 2 best friends and you think, oh, it'd be fun to go into business with them, do you want each of their spouses to be in there making decisions with you if something happens to your friend? A lot of times we don't. So you have to have rules laid out for what happens. They have a financial interest in that business that's separate from their ability to make decisions and manage the business. So that's a provision you need to have in any sort of partnership agreement. And then finally, a dissolution plan, okay? So this can be if we all decide we're gonna walk away. It can also be if one person wants to leave, but the others are staying put. A lot of times we call this a buy-sell agreement. And as the name suggests, it's got provisions for when someone might buy or sell their interest in a business. I like to analogize this agreement to a prenuptial agreement, okay? If you're not familiar with prenuptial agreements, most people don't have them in a first marriage or a first relationship, but if you've been divorced or widowed, you have kids from your prior marriage, and you have some assets and you're marrying another person who's got similar circumstances, you might want to protect those assets for your kids, not for your new spouse's kids, right? And so that's what a prenuptial agreement does in a marriage situation. But in a business, this prenuptial agreement, or buy sell, and that's not the only kind of prenuptial type portion of an agreement, but the buy sell is really important, because what it does is says when we are no longer operating as business partners, when we want to separate and go lead separate lives, we need to have rules for figuring out who's going to pay whom, how we're going to value that, and how those payments get handled. So take, for instance, again, the one partner who is working in the business full-time and the others are just investors. One of the investor partners says, I'm done, I don't really want to be involved in this. I've got other projects in life. His equity in the business, let's say, is $100,000. Well, he thinks it's $100,000, but what if the other partners disagree? First of all, you got to figure out, well, what is that person's interest in the business? There are formulas for figuring this out. You can come up with your own rules, but you got to have something that says, here's how we're going to value this business if one of the partners wants to walk away. The second thing is, do they get to force you to pay them in cash with payments? Like, what is that schedule going to be? Because if it's $100,000, maybe the bank or the business doesn't have $100,000 in the bank, or maybe it's got $100,000, but that would drain the accounts. So what's the schedule for that payout going to look like? There are other details that go into that, but those are a couple of the big ones. Again, I call this kind of like the business prenuptial agreement. How are you going to split up and separate at some future date? And if you're thinking, you know what, we'll deal with that later, what I will tell you is, no, you're not. You're not going to think of it later. You need to do this stuff before you enter the relationship, because you will start to see things in the business where you're like, I see a weakness here, or I see things that my partner does that I'm not necessarily crazy about. You might still be able to work together, but you see issues that come to light as you're working together that weren't apparent to you early on. A year, 2, 3 years into your partnership, you might be like, let's take care of getting a buy-sell agreement, because you're thinking maybe I want to separate and get out of the business, but that's a few years down the road, so maybe we'll just get it now. You will find yourself arguing about things at that point in time that will actually accelerate, in all likelihood, the split, okay? And at that point in time, once the cat's out of the bag, once somebody says the quiet thing out loud and says, I'm done, I don't want to be here anymore, you're no longer having a neutral conversation about, hypothetically, if one of us wants to leave the business, how will we value it? Instead, you're now talking about how much is coming out of my pocket to pay you when you're walking away. There's a lot of tension, a lot of feelings, and frankly, a lot of money on the line. So I really encourage you to get this stuff penciled out before you get into business with one another. That's often hard to do because it costs money to get it, but we don't have a lot of money to start the business. Happy to work with you if you got questions about any of that stuff. This is a longer video because there's just so much that goes into this, and frankly, each of these provisions can be their own video. So I appreciate you sticking with me throughout the end of this video. If you got questions about any of this stuff, I'd love to hear from you. Reach out, take care. Otherwise, I will see you next week. Thanks. Bye.